My father slammed his fist onto the Thanksgiving dining table hard enough to shatter a crystal wine glass, pointing a trembling finger right at my face. He told me and my 7-year-old son to pack our bags and get out of his house by the weekend, publicly branding me a freeloading single mother in front of 30 relatives. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply wiped my son's mouth, sent him upstairs to play, and pulled a single document from my briefcase. A document proving that my father had not owned this house in 5 years, and that he and his golden child had exactly 24 hours to vacate my property. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to evict toxic family members from your life and your home. My name is Kendra, and I am 35 years old. I work as a forensic accountant, a job that requires me to look past the lies people tell and focus entirely on the hard, unyielding truth of numbers. Numbers do not care about your feelings, and they certainly do not care about family loyalty. I learned that lesson the hard way. For the past 2 years, I had been living in what everyone believed was my parents' sprawling estate in a prestigious suburban neighborhood. I kept my head down, raised my son Trey in quiet dignity, and absorbed the relentless, passive-aggressive comments from my family. But Thanksgiving dinner was the day the Cold War went nuclear. We were seated around the massive mahogany dining table, surrounded by extended aunts, uncles, and cousins who had driven in for the holiday. The air was thick with the smell of roasted turkey collard greens and the suffocating weight of my father Jerome's ego. He was a man who cared more about his image as a pillar of the community than he did about the actual well-being of his children. Across from me sat my younger sister Chantel and her husband Preston. Chantel was 32, draped in designer clothes she could not actually afford, and Preston was a 34-year-old white man who constantly bragged about his crypto investments and tech startups, all of which miraculously failed to produce any actual income. I was in the middle of cutting a small piece of turkey for Trey when the crystal glass shattered. The sharp sound brought the entire dining room to a dead silence. I looked up to see my father standing at the head of the table, his face flushed with sudden anger, a vein bulging in his neck. He glared down at me as if I were a stranger who had wandered off the street to steal a meal. He cleared his throat loudly, making sure every single relative in the room had their eyes fixed on me. He announced that Chantel and Preston were expecting their second child. There were a few scattered gasps and murmurs of congratulations, but my father held up his hand to silence them. He then declared that because Chantel's growing family needed more space, they would be taking over the entire east wing of the house. That included the master suite I currently occupied with Trey. I waited for the punchline, but my father was dead serious. He looked down his nose at me and stated that it was time for me to stop leeching off his hard-earned success. He demanded that Trey and I pack our belongings and relocate to a cramped, notoriously moldy apartment complex on the other side of town by Sunday evening. He actually said the words "freeloading single mother" out loud, letting the insult hang in the air for all our relatives to digest. He said I had been riding his coattails for far too long, and that I needed to step aside for the daughter who was actually building a traditional, respectable family. The humiliation was designed to break me. I could feel the pitying stares of my aunts and uncles burning into the side of my face. My son shifted uncomfortably in his chair, sensing the sudden hostility directed at us. But I did not give my father the reaction he desperately wanted. I did not shrink down, and I did not argue. I calmly placed my fork down, picked up a linen napkin, and gently wiped the corner of Trey's mouth. I leaned over and whispered in his ear, telling him to go upstairs to my room, lock the door, and put on his gaming headset. Trey nodded quietly and slipped away from the table. I waited until I heard his footsteps reach the top of the stairs before I turned my attention back to the firing squad. My mother Brenda did not miss a beat. Seeing that I was not completely shattered by my father's demand, she decided to twist the knife. She smoothed down her silk blouse and sighed dramatically, telling the room that this was exactly what happened when you raised a child who lacked family values. She reminded everyone for the 100th time how I had abandoned the family to attend Howard University in Washington, D.C., rather than staying local like Chantel did. She praised Preston, calling his latest non-existent tech venture a stroke of absolute brilliance, and contrasted his imaginary success with my quiet, supposedly mediocre career. She told me I should be grateful they had allowed me to stay this long, completely ignoring the fact that I paid for all the groceries, the utilities, and the property taxes. Then came Preston. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his bourbon with a smug, self-satisfied grin on his face. He reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table toward me. It stopped right next to the cranberry sauce. I looked down at it. It was a printed 30-day eviction notice drafted with generic legal jargon he had clearly copied and pasted from the internet. Preston looked at me with an unbearable condescension, using that soft, patronizing tone he reserved for people he considered beneath him. He told me not to take it personally. He said it was just business, Kendra, and that in the real world, people have to pull their own weight. He actually had the audacity to offer to hire a moving van for me provided I was out by Sunday as instructed. Chantel sat next to him, admiring her manicure, acting as though my displacement was merely a minor logistical step in her grand life plan. I let the silence stretch for a long moment. I looked at my father's puffed-up chest, my mother's spiteful glare, Chantel's hollow vanity, and Preston's unearned arrogance. They had cornered me in front of our entire family, expecting me to beg for mercy or run from the room in tears. Instead, I reached down beneath my chair and picked up my leather briefcase. I placed it squarely on the dining table, the heavy brass clasps snapping open with a sharp, authoritative click. I bypassed the standard tax returns and bank statements I handled daily, reaching for a specific red folder I had kept hidden for half a decade. I pulled out the crisp, legally binding documents and dropped them right on top of Preston's fake eviction notice. The first document was a property deed. The second was an LLC transfer agreement fully notarized and stamped by the state. I looked directly at my father. My voice was steady, perfectly modulated, completely stripped of any emotion. I told the entire table that it was fascinating to hear my father speak about his hard-earned success, considering he had secretly gambled away his retirement savings 5 years ago. I watched the color completely drain from his face as the words registered. I explained loudly enough for the relatives in the back of the room to hear that the bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings on this very house. To save him from the ultimate community embarrassment, I had stepped in. I purchased the estate through a blind trust LLC, paying off his debts, and assuming full financial control of the property. My mother dropped her fork. It clattered loudly against her china plate. Chantel stopped admiring her nails, her mouth falling open in a display of pure shock. Preston leaned forward, his smug grin vanishing as his eyes darted over the official state seals on the paperwork. I reached out and picked up Preston's copied and pasted eviction notice. I tore it neatly in half, and then in half again, letting the pieces flutter down onto the table. I looked Preston dead in the eye and agreed with him. I told him he was absolutely right, it was just business. And since neither he nor Chantel nor my parents had paid a single dime of rent to my LLC in 2 years, they were officially trespassing. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute finality in my tone made the room feel ice cold. I told them that their bags needed to be packed immediately. I gave my father, my mother, my sister, and her arrogant husband exactly 24 hours to vacate my property before I called the county sheriff to have them forcibly removed for trespassing. The sound of my 7-year-old son's footsteps faded into the upper hallway, followed by the soft click of my bedroom door closing. The moment the latch caught, the atmosphere in the dining room shifted. My father remained standing, his chest puffed out in righteous indignation, waiting for me to break down. He expected me to beg. He expected me to negotiate. But when I remained perfectly still, simply resting my hands on the edge of the mahogany table, my mother decided his attack was not quite enough. Brenda neatly placed her silver fork down on her fine china plate. She dabbed the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin, her face arranged into an expression of profound disappointment. It was the same look she had weaponized against me for 3 decades. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, and let out a long, heavy sigh that was designed to draw the attention of every aunt and uncle in the room. She told me that my father was right, and that it broke her heart to say it out loud. She looked around the table, playing the role of the long-suffering matriarch to absolute perfection. She announced to the captive audience that she had tried her best to instill family values in me, but that I had always been undeniably selfish. According to her, the cracks in my character had shown themselves the moment I packed my bags at 18 and left for Washington, D.C. She reminded everyone how I had chosen to attend Howard University, abandoning my family, acting as though our suburban life was not good enough for me. She painted my pursuit of higher education and financial independence not as an achievement, but as a deep betrayal of our family unit. She contrasted my perceived failures with Chantel's loyalty. Chantel, she declared, had stayed close to home. Chantel had respected the family structure. Chantel had found a brilliant, ambitious husband to build a life with. My mother looked at Preston with overwhelming adoration, praising his completely non-existent tech empire. She told the room that Preston was a visionary, a man who understood how to build generational wealth, while I was just a woman pushing numbers around on a spreadsheet for a steady paycheck. She told me I should be on my knees thanking them for allowing me to take up space in a house that belonged to real contributing adults. Chantel soaked up our mother's praise like a sponge. She sat up straighter, adjusting the collar of her designer blouse. She looked at me with a smirk that she did not even try to hide. She began talking about my bedroom as if I had already packed my bags and moved out. She told Preston loud enough for me to hear that she wanted to rip out the dark hardwood floors in my suite and replace them with plush cream-colored carpeting for the new baby. She complained that my custom-built walk-in closet would have to be completely demolished to make room for the imported Italian cribs she had already picked out online. The sheer audacity of her discussing the demolition of my personal sanctuary while eating the turkey I had paid for was staggering. She looked at me and casually suggested that I should start packing the heavy items tonight so I would not be rushing on Sunday. The aunts and uncles murmured in agreement, nodding along with my mother and sister. In their eyes, I was exactly what my parents claimed I was, a stubborn, ungrateful woman who had failed to secure a husband and was now dragging down the true stars of the family. Not a single person at that table stopped to ask why I was the one who had purchased the holiday groceries. Not one of them wondered why my name was on the return address of the invitations. They simply accepted the narrative that I was a parasite. Then the true architect of this delusion decided to speak. Preston chuckled, a low, patronizing sound that grated against my ears. He leaned back in his heavy oak chair, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. He unbuttoned his tailored blazer, playing the role of the benevolent patriarch managing a difficult employee. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a piece of paper that had been folded into perfect thirds. He tossed it onto the table. It slid across the polished wood, stopping inches from my plate, right next to the crystal bowl of cranberry sauce. I looked down at it. It was a printed document. Preston rested his arms on the table and looked at me with an insufferable expression of pity mixed with superiority. He told me that he knew this felt sudden, but that in the real world, adults had to make hard choices. He used his soft corporate voice, the one he probably used to scam investors out of their venture capital. He explained that the document was a formal 30-day eviction notice. He said he had his corporate lawyers drafted up to make sure everything was handled legally and properly, so there would be no misunderstandings. He told me that I needed to pull my own weight. He said that while the notice legally gave me 30 days, he and Chantel strongly expected me to be out by Sunday evening. He claimed that having a toxic energy in the house was bad for Chantel's pregnancy, and that for the sake of the baby, I needed to vacate the premises quickly and quietly. He even smiled a cold, calculating smirk and offered to cover the cost of a moving van if I agreed not to cause a scene. He called it a severance package for my time in the house. He finished his little speech by telling me that it was nothing personal. "It is just business, Kendra," he said, taking a slow sip of his bourbon. I sat there in the heavy silence, staring at the piece of paper. As a forensic accountant, my entire career was built on examining documents. I did not need to pick it up to know it was a complete fabrication. Even upside down, I could see the generic formatting. I could see that there was no county seal, no notary signature, and no official court filing number. It was a free template he had downloaded off the internet and filled out with a ballpoint pen. He had actually typed the words freeloading tenant in the section meant for the leaseholder's name. He thought I was stupid. He thought because he was a white man in a custom suit who used words like asset allocation and liability, I would simply bow my head and submit to his authority. He thought my parents' backing gave him the absolute power to strip me of my home. He thought the social pressure of 30 relatives staring at me would force me into total compliance. I let them enjoy their victory for exactly 30 seconds. I let my mother feel vindicated. I let Chantel imagine her brand new nursery. I let Preston revel in his fake power. I sat there breathing evenly, feeling the cold, hard certainty of the truth anchored deep in my chest. They had played their hand perfectly, orchestrating a public execution of my character. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They had forgotten who actually owned the chessboard. I slowly reached out and placed my hand flat over the fake eviction notice. I kept my hand flat on the fake eviction notice, feeling the cheap, thin printer paper beneath my palm. The entire room was holding its breath. Preston sat there with that smug, self-satisfied smirk glued to his face, fully expecting me to burst into tears or storm away from the table in defeat. My mother looked victorious, her chin tilted up, waiting for the unruly daughter to finally be put in her place. My father had his arms crossed over his chest, projecting the image of a strong patriarch, making a tough but necessary decision for the good of the family. Chantel was already staring at the ceiling, probably calculating the square footage of my bedroom and deciding what color to paint the nursery walls. They had built a magnificent stage for my humiliation. But they did not realize I controlled the lights, the script, and the very floor they were standing on. I did not slide the paper back to Preston. I did not crumble it up in a fit of rage. I simply kept my hand resting on it and shifted my gaze from Preston to my father. I looked deep into his eyes, searching for even a sliver of paternal guilt. But there was nothing there except pure, unfiltered arrogance. He truly believed he was untouchable. I slowly reached down to my feet where my heavy leather briefcase was resting against the leg of the dining chair. I lifted it up and placed it squarely on the mahogany table. The dull thud of the leather hitting the wood echoed in the silent room. I snapped the brass locks open. They made a sharp, authoritative sound that caused my mother to jump slightly in her seat. I bypassed the neatly organized client files, the corporate tax returns, and the audit reports that I handled on a daily basis. Instead, I reached straight for the bottom compartment. I pulled out a thick, fireproof red folder. I had kept this specific folder locked in a fireproof safe for the last 5 years, only bringing it out today because I knew exactly how this holiday dinner was going to play out. I had seen the warning signs for months. I knew my father was getting restless, and I knew Chantel and Preston were running out of money to fund their fake luxury lifestyle. I unclasped the red folder and extracted a small stack of heavy watermarked legal documents. The crisp white paper stood out starkly against the dark wood of the table. I looked at my father one last time, giving him a final chance to retract his cruel words. He just glared back at me, his jaw set in a hard line. So I dropped the bomb. I placed my hand on the documents and slid them directly across the table. They glided smoothly over the polished surface, bumping gently against the crystal bowl of cranberry sauce right in front of Preston. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away any trace of anger or sorrow. I looked at my father and told him it was fascinating to hear him speak so highly of his hard-earned success and his generational wealth. I told the room loud enough for the aunts and uncles sitting at the far ends of the table to hear clearly that it was a beautiful story he had been telling everyone. It was just a shame that none of it was true. The color began to drain from my father's face. He uncrossed his arms, his hands suddenly gripping the edge of the table. I did not stop. I explained to the captive audience that 5 years ago, the great pillar of the community, the man who just called me a freeloading single mother, had secretly gambled away his entire retirement savings. A collective gasp rippled through the dining room. Several relatives exchanged shocked, wide-eyed glances. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest, her carefully constructed matriarchal composure cracking instantly. I kept my eyes locked on my father as I laid out the exact truth. I detailed how his late-night trips to the casino and his private high-stakes poker games had spiraled completely out of control. He had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage on this beautiful suburban estate without telling anyone, not even my mother. I explained how 5 years ago he had defaulted on those loans. The bank had initiated quiet foreclosure proceedings. He was weeks away from the ultimate community embarrassment, weeks away from being physically locked out of his own home by the county sheriff. He was sweating now. A visible bead of perspiration rolled down the side of his face. He opened his mouth to speak to deny it, but no words came out. I turned my attention to Preston, who was staring down at the watermarked papers in front of him. I told him to go ahead and read them since he claimed to be so familiar with corporate law and asset allocation. I told him he was looking at the official county property deed and the limited liability company transfer agreements complete with the raised notary seals and the signature of the state registrar. I explained that when I discovered my father's financial ruin through my own forensic accounting network, I did not let him fail. Despite years of emotional neglect, I stepped in. I quietly liquidated my own stock portfolios and used my savings to purchase the estate through a blind trust right before it went to public auction. I paid off his gambling debts to save his reputation in the church and the community. I allowed them to continue living here, acting like they still owned the place to protect his fragile male ego. I had silently become his landlord, paying the property taxes, the maintenance, and the utility bills every single month, while he paraded around acting like a king. My mother was shaking her head rapidly back and forth, her perfectly styled hair falling into her eyes. She stammered out that it was a lie, that I was making it up to ruin the holiday. But Chantel was not looking at me. She was looking at her husband. Preston was pale. His eyes darted rapidly across the legal jargon on the deed. As a man who spent his life faking his way through business deals, he knew a real ironclad legal document when he saw one. He swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw ticking. He looked up at me, the smug arrogance completely wiped from his features, replaced by a sudden dawning terror. He realized that the woman he had just tried to evict was actually the sole proprietor and managing member of the trust that owned the roof over his head. I reached out and picked up the fake 30-day eviction notice Preston had printed from the internet. The cheap paper felt weightless in my hands compared to the heavy reality of the deed sitting in front of him. The dining room was so quiet you could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. 30 relatives were frozen in absolute stunned silence, watching the power dynamic of our family completely invert in the span of 3 minutes. I looked directly into Preston's panicked blue eyes. I gripped the edges of his fake document. With a swift, deliberate motion, I tore the paper straight down the middle. The ripping sound was loud and crisp in the silent room. I placed the torn halves neatly on top of each other and tore them again, letting the 4 pieces flutter down onto the table like snow. I smiled at him. It was a cold, calculating smile that did not reach my eyes. I told him that he was completely right. I told him it was just business, and that in the real world adults have to make hard choices and pull their own weight. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the mahogany table, addressing my parents, my sister, and her husband all at once. "Since none of you have paid a single dime of rent to my company in 2 years," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality, "you are officially trespassing. You all have exactly 24 hours to vacate my property." For a full 10 seconds, nobody breathed. The only sound in the sprawling dining room was the low hum of the central heating and the distant muffled sound of a video game coming from my son's room upstairs. I stood there, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the mahogany table, watching the reality of their situation slowly crash down on them. Then my father started to laugh. It was not a genuine laugh. It was a loud, forced, booming sound that echoed off the high ceiling, designed to mask the sudden terror in his eyes. He looked around the table at his brothers and sisters, desperately trying to corral them back into his version of reality. He pointed a shaking finger at me and told the room that I had finally lost my mind. He slapped his hand on the table and declared that I was pulling a pathetic stunt because I was jealous of my sister. He told everyone that I had obviously gone online, found some public templates just like Preston did, and forged a bunch of fake legal papers to cause a scene and ruin Thanksgiving. My mother immediately jumped on board his sinking ship. Brenda let out a dramatic sigh of relief, smoothing down her silk blouse as if my father's flimsy explanation had instantly cured her anxiety. She looked at me with deep disgust and told the extended family that this was exactly what she meant about my character. She accused me of being so bitter about being a single mother that I would actually commit fraud just to steal Chantel's joy. She warned me that forging state documents was a federal crime and that if I did not apologize right now, my father would have no choice but to call the police and have me locked up. I did not bother arguing with them. I did not need to defend the documents. The raised notary seals the county clerk watermarks, and the state registrar's signatures spoke for themselves. I simply looked at Preston. He was the only one not laughing. He was staring blankly at the torn pieces of his fake eviction notice, his face completely pale. He knew the difference between a downloaded internet template and a legally binding commercial trust transfer. He knew they were utterly ruined. But Chantel did not have Preston's business sense. She only had her vanity. While my parents tried to laugh off the situation, Chantel was completely unraveling. She did not care about blind trusts or LLCs or foreclosure proceedings. Her brain was solely focused on the immediate disruption to her luxury lifestyle. She stood up so fast that her heavy wooden dining chair tipped backward and crashed onto the hardwood floor. She slammed her hands on the table and began screaming at the top of her lungs. Her voice went completely shrill, echoing painfully in the dining room. She demanded to know what I meant by 24 hours. She shrieked that I could not do this to her because she had already hired an exclusive interior designer for the master suite. She threw her hands in the air hysterically, explaining to the stunned room that she had just paid a massive non-refundable deposit to have 2 custom Italian cribs imported from Milan. She cried that the cribs were specifically measured to fit in the alcove of my bedroom and that they would not fit anywhere else in the house. It was entirely surreal. Her husband was facing financial exposure. Her father had just been outed as a degenerate gambler who lost the family home. Her mother was in total denial. And Chantel was standing in the middle of a Thanksgiving dinner, screaming about imported Italian baby furniture. She acted as though I was personally ripping the future away from her unborn child, completely ignoring the fact that she had just spent the last 20 minutes trying to throw my actual living child onto the street. She pointed a manicured finger at my face and yelled that I was a monster. She demanded that I hand over the deed right now so she could tear it up and throw it in the fireplace. She screamed that the house belonged to her because she was the one building a real family, and that my father would never let a miserable spinster take her inheritance. I looked at her calmly and told her that inheritance only applies when there is actual wealth left to inherit. I told her that she was standing in my house eating my food and complaining about furniture she bought with money she did not actually have. That was the breaking point. Chantel completely lost whatever fragile grip she still had on her sanity. She let out a primal scream and lunged straight across the dining table. She did not care about the fine china or the crystal glasses. Her knee slammed into the table, knocking over a heavy silver gravy boat. Thick brown gravy spilled everywhere, pooling around the cranberry sauce and soaking into my mother's expensive linen tablecloth. Chantel stretched her arms out, her manicured claws frantically swiping at the crisp white legal documents resting near the center of the table. She was desperate to destroy the physical proof of her own downfall, operating under the childlike delusion that if she ripped up the paper, the reality of my ownership would simply vanish. But I had anticipated her reaction. I knew my sister better than she knew herself. I knew she lacked impulse control, and I knew she resorted to physical tantrums when she did not get her way. Before her fingers could even graze the edge of the property deed, I moved. I did not flinch, and I did not panic. I simply reached out and swiftly slid the stack of watermarked papers across the polished wood, pulling them safely out of her reach. Chantel's hands slapped down hard onto the empty space where the documents had been just a second before. Her momentum carried her forward, and she slipped on the spilled gravy, her chest hitting the edge of the table hard. She let out a gasp of pain, floundering awkwardly amid the ruined Thanksgiving spread. My mother screamed her name, rushing forward to help her precious golden child, frantically dabbing at Chantel's designer blouse with a napkin. I did not offer to help. I stood perfectly straight, holding the documents in my hand. I neatly tapped the edges of the papers against the table to align them, then slipped them back into the thick red fireproof folder. I picked up my leather briefcase, placed the red folder inside the secure bottom compartment, and closed the heavy lid. I pressed my thumb firmly against the biometric scanner next to the brass lock. A small LED light flashed green, followed by the heavy mechanical click of the internal steel bolts sliding into place. The briefcase was now impenetrable. Unless they planned on severing my thumb, there was no way they were getting those documents. I picked the briefcase up by its sturdy handle and looked down at my family. The illusion of their wealth, their superiority and their power, had been completely shattered, lying in ruins on the dining room table, right next to the spilled gravy and the torn pieces of Preston's fake eviction notice. The extended relatives were dead silent, staring at the scene in absolute shock. A few of my aunts were already reaching for their purses, realizing that the Thanksgiving dinner was over and that the family dynamic they had respected for decades was entirely fraudulent. I addressed my father, my mother Chantel, and Preston one last time before leaving the room. I kept my voice icy and authoritative, the tone of a landlord addressing a group of very problematic tenants. I told them that the clock was officially ticking. I advised them to spend less time crying over custom Italian cribs and more time packing their belongings into whatever luxury luggage they had left. I reminded them that if they were not completely off my property by tomorrow evening, they would be leaving in the back of a squad car. Without waiting for a response, I turned my back on them and walked out of the dining room. I headed straight for the stairs to check on my son, leaving my toxic family to choke on the bitter reality of the mess they had created for themselves. I had my hand on the carved oak banister, my foot resting on the first step of the staircase, when Preston burst through the dining room doors. He was moving fast, his heavy dress shoes slapping loudly against the marble tile of the foyer. He was desperate to intercept me before I could reach the sanctuary of the second floor. He stepped directly into my path, forcing me to stop, and tried to use his physical size to intimidate me. He stood entirely too close, his chest puffed out, attempting to tower over me and weaponize his height. Behind him, I could see my parents and Chantel hovering in the dining room doorway, watching the confrontation unfold. They were relying on Preston to be their white knight. They desperately needed the affluent, confident white man they had brought into the family to put me back in my place and restore their fractured reality. Preston dropped his voice into a low, aggressive register. He pointed a finger inches from my face and told me that I had just made the biggest mistake of my miserable life. He said I was entirely out of my depth and that playing landlord with a fake LLC was a cute stunt, but I had just crossed a line into serious criminal liability. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon and pure panic. He claimed that he had a team of high-powered corporate lawyers on speed dial in downtown Seattle. He threatened to call the senior partners right now, even on Thanksgiving, and have a judge freeze all of my financial assets by tomorrow morning. He promised to file an emergency injunction to keep me out of my own house. He said he would personally sue me for fraud, emotional distress, and unlawful eviction, and that he would tie me up in litigation for so many decades that I would be completely bankrupt before my son even graduated high school. He did not stop there. He threatened my career. He told me he was going to contact the state accounting board and report me for unethical financial practices, ensuring that my forensic accounting license would be permanently revoked. He smirked, a nasty, condescending expression returning to his face. He told me that I was a nobody, a glorified calculator who had no idea how real wealth and real power actually operated in this world. He told me to turn around, walk back into that dining room, hand over the biometric safe, and apologize to his wife, or he would utterly destroy my life. I stood perfectly still on the bottom step, looking up at him. I did not flinch away from his pointing finger. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. As a forensic accountant, I spent my life reading between the lines of financial statements, but I was equally skilled at reading people. I looked closely at the great corporate titan standing before me. I noticed the fine tremor in his hands. I saw the bead of sweat tracing the line of his jaw. I saw the rapid, shallow way his chest was moving. He was not a man operating from a position of power. He was a cornered animal trying to bluff his way out of a slaughterhouse. I waited until he completely ran out of breath. The foyer was completely silent, the tension so thick it felt like it could shatter the chandelier above us. I asked him one simple question. I asked him to name the law firm. Preston blinked clearly, not expecting me to challenge him on the specifics. He opened his mouth, stammered for a second, and aggressively repeated that he had top-tier representation and that I did not need to worry about the name until I was served with the paperwork. I nodded slowly, acting as though I was carefully considering his threat. I stepped off the stairs and walked over to the antique console table sitting against the foyer wall. I reached into the deep side pocket of my leather tote bag, a pocket I had intentionally left unlocked. I pulled out a thin blue manila folder. I had prepared this specific file months ago, knowing that the day would eventually come when Preston would try to use his imaginary wealth as a weapon against me. I tossed the blue folder onto the marble surface of the console table. It landed with a soft slap. I turned back to Preston and told him to go ahead and call his high-powered legal team. I told him I highly encouraged it, but I was just curious how he was going to afford their retainer. Preston stared at the blue folder. He did not move to touch it. His arrogant posture began to deflate instantly. I did not need him to read the documents. I had already memorized them. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered the first sentence. I told him that his first crypto startup, Apex Ledger, filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy exactly 14 months ago, leaving him with $80,000 in unpaid tax liabilities that the IRS was currently threatening to garnish. My sister Chantel let out a sharp gasp from the doorway. Preston swallowed hard, all the color draining from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. I did not give him a chance to recover. I delivered the second sentence. I informed him that his second venture, a supposedly revolutionary blockchain security firm, was currently under an active federal investigation for wire fraud because he had funneled investor capital straight into his personal checking account to buy Chantel her designer wardrobe. My father took a step back, bumping into the doorframe, his eyes wide with horror as he realized his brilliant son-in-law was nothing more than a common criminal. I stepped right up to Preston, invading his space just as he had invaded mine a minute earlier. I looked at the broken man hiding inside the custom-tailored suit and delivered the final sentence. I told him that as of this morning his primary bank account was overdrawn by $412, meaning he was not a wealthy investor, but a broke, desperate con artist who was entirely dependent on the charity of the woman he just tried to evict. Preston's mouth opened and closed silently. The threat of his corporate lawyers, his supposed influence, and his white knight bravado vanished into thin air. He had absolutely nothing left. He looked back at his pregnant wife, who was staring at him with a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. He had spent years cultivating the image of an elite financial guru, mocking my steady career while living under my roof and eating the food I bought. Now his entire facade had been meticulously dismantled in less than 60 seconds. I left the blue folder on the table for him. I turned away, gripped the wooden banister, and began walking up the stairs to my son, leaving Preston standing frozen in the foyer as the devastating reality of his financial ruin echoed through the silent house. I reached the top of the sweeping oak staircase and paused on the landing. From this vantage point, I had a perfect view of the foyer and the dining room below. Preston was still rooted to the marble floor, looking like a man who had just watched his entire life evaporate before his eyes. My father was pacing back and forth in the dining room, his heavy footsteps thudding against the hardwood, loudly yelling at my mother to do something to fix the situation. My mother was frantically trying to clean up the spilled gravy with a cloth napkin, muttering under her breath about how I had deliberately ruined the holiday for everyone. I leaned against the polished wooden banister and pulled my phone from my pocket. It was time to remind them that my ownership of this estate was not just a piece of paper sitting inside a biometric safe. It was absolute tangible control over every single aspect of their daily lives. I unlocked my screen and opened the centralized smart home application. I had personally installed the system 3 years ago under the guise of upgrading the property's security. My father had praised the upgrade at the time, bragging to his friends about his high-tech house. In reality, I was making sure I held the master administrative rights to the entire electrical grid. First, I navigated to the perimeter defense settings. I deleted my father's master access code for the front gate. I deleted my mother's code. I deleted Chantel and Preston's codes. I generated a new randomized 16-digit alphanumeric passcode and set it as the only active credential. If any of them stepped off the property, they were never getting back inside without my explicit permission. Next, I moved to the climate control tab. My sister Chantel treated the east wing of the house like her own personal luxury resort. She kept her bedroom and private sitting area at a balmy 74 degrees year-round, completely oblivious to the massive utility bills I paid every single month to maintain her comfort. I selected the two specific HVAC zones covering her suite. With a simple swipe of my thumb, I dropped the target temperature down to a brisk 60 degrees. I then tapped the small padlock icon on the screen, engaging the administrative override. The digital thermostats in her rooms were now permanently locked. She could press the buttons on the wall all she wanted, but the heating system would not respond. Let her see how comfortable she felt in a freezing room while demanding imported Italian cribs. Finally, I opened the network router configuration portal. This was where the real power lay. In our modern world, cutting off someone's internet access is the quickest way to induce sheer panic. Our sprawling suburban neighborhood was notorious for having terrible cellular reception. The thick brick walls of the colonial estate made it a complete dead zone for mobile data. The only way to communicate with the outside world or check a bank balance was through the high-speed fiber optic Wi-Fi network that I paid for. I scrolled through the list of connected devices. It was incredibly easy to identify my sister's hardware because her vanity extended even to her electronics. She had proudly named her devices using her full name. I found Chantel's iPhone, Chantel's iPad Pro, and the 70-inch smart television in her private suite. I found Preston's laptop and his personal phone. One by one, I tapped their specific MAC addresses and added them to the router's permanent block list. I watched the status icons turn from a healthy green to a harsh, disconnected red. As a final measure, I changed the main network password just in case they tried to reconnect using my parents' devices. I did not have to wait long for the results. Within 30 seconds, the shrieking started. Chantel stormed out of the dining room and into the foyer, aggressively tapping the screen of her phone. She yelled to Preston that her internet was down and that she could not access her social media to post her Thanksgiving pictures. She demanded that he go into the hallway and reset the router immediately. Preston did not move. He was too busy staring at his own phone, rapidly refreshing his email application over and over again, watching the connection error message flash across his screen. He desperately needed to contact his imaginary lawyers, his non-existent business partners, or perhaps just check his overdrawn bank account one more time. But he was completely cut off from the digital world. My father marched into the foyer right behind Chantel, pulling his phone from his pocket. He loudly complained that the signal had dropped and that he needed to make an important call to his brother to explain the situation. He looked up the stairs and saw me standing quietly on the landing, bathed in the soft light of the chandelier. He pointed his phone at me and ordered me to fix the internet right this second. I looked down at him. I kept my voice perfectly calm. I told him that the high-speed Wi-Fi was an amenity provided strictly to rent-paying tenants. I reminded him that since they were currently classified as hostile trespassers facing an active 24-hour eviction, I was under no legal obligation to provide them with internet perimeter security or central heating. I told him he had exactly 23 hours and 45 minutes left to pack his bags, and that I suggested he use that time wisely instead of worrying about a wireless connection. My father's face contorted in absolute fury. He took a heavy step toward the stairs, raising his voice, preparing to launch into another tirade about respect and family hierarchy. But before he could even get the words out of his mouth, my phone buzzed heavily in the palm of my hand. It was not a standard text message. It was a secure push notification from an encrypted messaging application I use strictly for confidential forensic accounting work. The sender was David, a private investigator and former financial crimes detective I frequently contracted when a corporate audit required a deeper off-the-books investigation. I had hired David 2 weeks ago to look into Preston's background. I already knew about the bankruptcies and the overdrawn checking accounts. But my professional instinct told me there was something much more sinister lurking beneath Preston's polished exterior. Men like Preston did not just lose their own money. They were financial parasites. They always found a host to drain before they finally went down. I needed to know exactly how deep the rot went. I unlocked the encrypted application and opened David's message. The text was brief, clinical, and absolutely devastating. David wrote that Preston did not just lose his venture capital money in the recent crypto collapse. He wrote that Preston had been desperately trying to cover massive illegal margin calls for the past 6 months to keep his fake luxury lifestyle afloat. The message ended with 2 sentences that made the blood freeze in my veins. David told me to look at the attached PDF file immediately. He said that Preston had used my father Jerome's retirement account to cover his margins. I stood frozen on the landing, my eyes locked on the glowing screen. I tapped the secure attachment, downloading the encrypted file directly to my device. It opened to reveal a series of highly confidential wire transfer logs, bank statements, and unauthorized withdrawal receipts. As a forensic accountant, I could read the story hidden in the numbers within seconds. It was an absolute bloodbath. Over the course of 6 months, Preston had systematically drained my father's remaining pension fund and the small investment portfolio my father had managed to scrape together after the foreclosure disaster 5 years ago. The documents showed how Preston had forged my father's digital signature, bypassed the dual authentication protocols, and siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars into untraceable offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. The money was completely gone. It had vanished into the digital ether, leaving my father with absolutely nothing. My father had spent the entire Thanksgiving dinner aggressively defending Preston. He had called Preston a brilliant visionary. He had tried to throw me and my 7-year-old son out onto the street to make room for a man he believed was the savior of our family's financial legacy. He had sneered at my career, calling me a glorified calculator, all while the golden son-in-law he worshipped was quietly robbing him completely blind. I looked down at the foyer. My father was still glaring up at me, waiting for me to back down and turn the internet back on. Preston was standing just a few feet away from him, sweating profusely, staring blankly at his useless phone, completely unaware that I was currently holding the undeniable digital evidence of his grand larceny. Chantel was whining loudly to my mother about how her bedroom suddenly felt drafty and freezing cold. The sheer poetic justice of the situation was almost overwhelming. They were a fragile house of cards propped up entirely by arrogance, delusion, and vicious lies. And I was the only one holding the fan. I did not say a single word to my father. I did not need to. The ammunition I had just received was far too explosive to waste on a shouting match from the top of the stairs. I needed to wait for the absolute perfect moment to detonate it, a moment where the collateral damage to their egos would be absolute and irreversible. I locked my phone screen, slipped the device back into my pocket, and turned my back on them. I walked quietly down the carpeted hallway and slipped into my son's bedroom, locking the door behind me, leaving them trapped downstairs in a cold, silent house with absolutely no way out of the nightmare they had created for themselves. The grandfather clock in the downstairs hallway began to chime its deep, resonant tones, echoing through the chilly house. It was exactly 6 o'clock on Friday evening. The 24-hour deadline I had issued at the Thanksgiving dinner table was officially up. I picked up my heavy leather briefcase from my bedroom desk, gave my son Trey a reassuring smile as he played his video game and walked out into the hallway. I descended the sweeping oak staircase, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The house was cold, hovering around 60 degrees, and an oppressive, hostile silence had settled over the main floor. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I turned toward the formal living room. I fully expected a battle, but what I saw confirmed exactly how deeply entrenched their delusion really was. There were no cardboard boxes. There were no packed suitcases waiting by the front door. None of them had even changed out of their loungewear. My family was gathered in the living room, huddled together like survivors of a shipwreck. Chantel was wrapped tightly in a thick cashmere blanket sitting on the edge of the leather sofa, with her arms crossed, looking utterly miserable. Preston stood near the unlit fireplace. He looked disheveled, his designer shirt wrinkled, but he still wore that completely unearned expression of arrogant defiance. My mother and father were seated in the matching armchairs, rigid and waiting. I stopped at the threshold of the living room, holding my briefcase by my side. I looked directly at my father and stated simply that the 24 hours had expired. I asked them why their belongings were not waiting on the front porch. Preston let out a sharp, condescending laugh. He stepped away from the fireplace, running a hand through his messy hair. He looked at me with a smug, victorious grin. He announced that they were not going anywhere. He proudly explained that he had spent the morning walking a mile down to the main road just to get a cellular signal, since I had maliciously cut off the house network. He said he had spent hours researching state tenant laws and property rights on his phone. He crossed his arms and told me that I could wave my little property deed around all I wanted, but the law protected them. He declared that since they had been living at the residence for over 2 years, they had established legal tenancy. He threw around terms like squatters' rights and adverse possession, butchering the legal definitions completely. He told me that even if I was the legal owner, I would have to file a formal eviction through the court system, wait for a hearing, and secure a mandate from a judge. He smiled a wicked, triumphant smile and said that the entire process would take at least 6 months, and until then I could not legally force them to leave. He instructed me to stop throwing a temper tantrum, turn the central heating back on, and reconnect the internet before he decided to sue me for creating an uninhabitable living environment. Before I could even address Preston's profound misunderstanding of the law, a heavy knock sounded at the front door. My father stood up immediately. The tense, angry posture he had been holding vanished, replaced by a look of absolute pious relief. He smoothed down the front of his sweater, looked at me with a victorious glint in his eye, and walked briskly to the foyer. He opened the heavy front door, and I watched as 3 men stepped out of the freezing November air and into my house. The man in the center was Pastor Williams. He was the senior pastor of the massive, influential church my family had attended since I was a little girl. Flanking him were Deacon Miller and Deacon Hayes, 2 of the most respected elders in our congregation. These were men who held immense social power in our local community. A word of disapproval from Pastor Williams could ruin a family's reputation permanently. My father immediately switched into his performance. He reached out and grabbed Pastor Williams by the hand, pulling him into a firm embrace. My father's voice actually trembled as he thanked the men for coming on such short notice. He played the role of the exhausted, heartbroken patriarch to absolute perfection. He whispered that the devil had truly taken hold of his household and that he did not know where else to turn. He guided the 3 men into the living room. As soon as they entered, my mother stood up. Brenda immediately pulled a tissue from her pocket and began dabbing at the corners of her perfectly dry eyes. She greeted the pastor with a shaky, fragile voice, acting as though she had spent the entire night weeping in prayer. Pastor Williams looked around the cold living room, his eyes taking in Chantel shivering under her blanket and Preston standing protectively nearby. Finally, his gaze settled on me. It was a look of profound paternal disappointment. He walked toward me, stopping just a few feet away, clutching a leather-bound Bible in his left hand. He spoke in that deep, resonant preaching voice he used on Sunday mornings. He said my name slowly, shaking his head. He told me that he had baptized me when I was a baby. He said he had watched me grow up in the pews of his church, and he could not believe the hostility he was witnessing today. He explained that my father had driven to the church office that morning in a state of absolute despair. According to my father's tragic narrative, the pressures of my corporate job and the bitterness of being a single mother had corrupted my spirit. My father had spun a beautiful tragic tale about how I had manipulated financial documents to steal the family home and how I was now trying to throw my own pregnant sister out into the freezing cold just to satisfy my own bruised ego. Pastor Williams opened his Bible. He did not read from it, but he used it as a prop to add divine weight to his words. He began to lecture me on the sacred, unbreakable bond of the family unit. He reminded me of the biblical commandment to honor my father and mother, stating that a child who disrespects their parents is inviting ruin into their own life. He pointed a finger at Chantel. He called her unborn child a precious blessing from God, a blessing that should be nurtured and protected by the entire family, not threatened with homelessness. He looked over at Preston, nodding respectfully at the man who had just stolen my father's retirement fund, and praised Preston for standing by his wife during this vicious attack. The pressure in the room was suffocating. This was the ultimate weapon in my parents' arsenal. In our community, the church was the absolute moral authority. To stand against the pastor and the elders was to invite complete social exile. My parents knew that I was a private person who hated public confrontation. They were banking on the fact that the cultural conditioning of my childhood would kick in, forcing me to bow my head, apologize for my disrespect, and sweep their toxic abuse completely under the rug to maintain the illusion of family peace. My mother sniffled loudly, adding her own layer to the guilt trip. She told the pastor that she had tried her best to raise me with a gentle heart, but that I had always been so cold and calculating. She said she was willing to forgive me right here and now if I would just drop this ridiculous eviction stunt and act like a real sister. Pastor Williams took a step closer to me. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of gentle pastoral command. He told me that true wealth is not found in real estate, limited liability companies, or bank accounts. True wealth, he said, is found in the grace of forgiveness and the love of family. He urged me to repent for the pain I had caused. He instructed me to walk over to the thermostat, turn the heat back on, restore the internet connection, and sit down with my parents so we could pray together and heal this fractured home. He finished his speech and stood there waiting for my submission. The deacons watched me sternly. My father looked incredibly smug, knowing he had successfully backed me into a corner. Preston was grinning again, clearly thrilled that his amateur legal theories were being backed up by divine intervention. They all expected me to break. They expected the weight of the church, the guilt of the community, and the sheer audacity of their gaslighting to force me to surrender my keys. I stood perfectly still, my hand gripping the handle of my briefcase. I let the silence stretch, feeling the cold air of the living room against my face, preparing to completely dismantle the foundation of their entire existence. I did not raise my voice to defend myself against the pastor's accusations. I simply placed my heavy leather briefcase onto the glass coffee table in the center of the living room. I pressed my thumb against the biometric lock. The sharp click echoed in the quiet room. I bypassed the red folder containing the property deed and instead pulled out a thick black binder. I had meticulously organized this binder over the last 5 years, keeping a flawless record of every single dime I had spent keeping this family from sinking into absolute poverty. I stepped toward Pastor Williams and respectfully held the binder out to him. I told him that I appreciated his spiritual guidance and his dedication to the truth. I said that since we were discussing honesty and family values in the presence of God, I wanted him to look at the truth with his own eyes, rather than relying on my father's desperate fiction. Pastor Williams hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking the binder. Deacon Miller and Deacon Hayes stepped closer, looking over his shoulder. I instructed the pastor to open to the first tab. I kept my voice steady and professional. I told him he was looking at the original foreclosure notices sent to this exact address 5 years ago. I explained that while my father was standing at the pulpit on Sunday mornings preaching about financial stewardship, he was spending his Saturday nights losing hundreds of thousands of dollars at underground poker tables and high-stakes casinos. My father let out a strangled gasp. He took a step forward, his hands raised frantically. telling the pastor not to look at those papers because I had doctored them. He sounded incredibly small, his booming patriarchal voice reducing to a desperate whine. Deacon Hayes held up a stern hand, stopping my father in his tracks. The deacon pointed to the official county watermark on the foreclosure notice and told my father to remain silent while they reviewed the documents. I told Pastor Williams to turn to the second tab. I explained that those were the closing documents for the blind trust I had established. I detailed how I had liquidated my own retirement accounts and drained my savings to pay off my father's massive gambling debts and buy the house in cash just days before the bank auctioned it off to the public. I told the pastor that I did not steal the family home. I rescued it. I explained that I had kept my ownership a secret for 5 years specifically to protect my father's fragile pride and his prestigious standing within the church community. The color was rapidly draining from Pastor Williams' face as he flipped through page after page of undeniable financial proof. I then asked him to turn to the third tab. This section was filled with hundreds of receipts. I told the church elders that they were looking at 5 years' worth of paid property taxes, water bills, electricity bills, and maintenance costs. I pointed directly at my mother, who was now shrinking back into her armchair, looking completely terrified. I stated that my parents had not contributed a single dollar to the upkeep of this household. I paid for the roof over their heads, the food on their table, and the electricity that powered their appliances. I told the pastor that the only reason the heat was currently turned off was because the people standing in this room had cornered me at Thanksgiving dinner yesterday and handed me a fake eviction notice. I turned my gaze to Preston, who had suddenly lost his smug grin and was trying to subtly edge his way toward the hallway. I pointed at him and told the pastor that my sister's brilliant husband had printed a fraudulent legal document from the internet and tried to throw me and my 7-year-old son out onto the street. I explained that they wanted to kick me out of the very house I owned simply because my sister wanted my master bedroom for her imported Italian cribs. I looked back at Pastor Williams. His hands were actually shaking as he held the binder. The righteous indignation he had walked in with was completely gone, replaced by profound shock and deep revulsion. He was a man who detested liars, and he had just realized that one of his most trusted congregants had used him as a pawn in a malicious scheme to abuse his own daughter. Pastor Williams slowly closed the black binder. The sound was like a gavel dropping in a courtroom. He handed it back to me with a slight bow of his head, his eyes filled with a mixture of apology and deep sorrow. He turned slowly to face my father. My father was sweating profusely. He plastered a sickly, terrified smile onto his face and reached out his hands. He tried to speak, stammering about misunderstandings and family disputes being complicated. He tried to say that the numbers did not tell the whole story. Pastor Williams cut him off. His voice was no longer the gentle pastoral tone he had used with me. It was the booming, authoritative voice of a man delivering a final judgment. He told my father that he was looking at a man completely consumed by the sins of pride, greed, and deceit. He said he was absolutely appalled that my father would dare to drag the church into his web of lies, attempting to use the word of God to bully the very daughter who had sacrificed her own financial security to save him from ruin. Deacon Miller spoke up next, his voice dripping with disgust. He told my father that his actions were a disgrace to the community. He said that coming to the church office and crying fake tears about a stolen house while hiding a gambling addiction was an unforgivable breach of trust. My father looked around frantically, his chest heaving. He looked at my mother for support, but Brenda was staring at the floor, completely paralyzed by the social humiliation unfolding before her. She knew that the moment these 3 men walked out the door, her reign as a respected society matron was permanently over. The gossip would spread through the congregation by Sunday morning, and they would be absolute pariahs. My father tried one last desperate tactic. He fell to his knees right there on the living room rug. He clasped his hands together and began to weep loud theatrical tears, begging Pastor Williams to pray with him, begging for the grace and forgiveness the pastor had spoken about just 10 minutes earlier. Pastor Williams looked down at him with an expression of pure pity. He adjusted his suit jacket and gripped his Bible tightly. He told my father that forgiveness is a matter between a man and God, but that trust within a community must be earned. He stated clearly that my father was no longer welcome to serve on the church leadership board, and that he strongly suggested my father seek professional help for his gambling addiction and his chronic dishonesty. Without another word to my parents, Pastor Williams turned to me. He offered a sincere, quiet apology for intruding on my home and for doubting my character. He told me that I had shown more grace and restraint than most people ever could. Deacon Hayes and Deacon Miller nodded in agreement, each offering me a respectful look before turning their backs on my family. The three men walked out of the living room, crossed the foyer, and let themselves out the front door. The heavy click of the latch closing behind them sealed my father's fate. His social standing, his reputation, and his community power vanished completely into the freezing November night. I stood in the center of the room holding my binder. My father was still kneeling on the rug, staring blankly at the front door. My mother had her face buried in her hands. Chantel was sobbing quietly into her blanket, and Preston was staring at the floor, completely silent. The ultimate weapon they had tried to use against me had just detonated in their own faces, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of their own lies. I looked at the grandfather clock in the hallway. I told them they now had less than 23 hours to get out of my house, and this time nobody argued. I left them sitting in the ruins of their pride and walked back up the stairs to my son's room. Trey was sitting on my bed, his gaming headset securely over his ears, completely insulated from the absolute chaos unfolding on the main floor. I smiled at him, brushed a hand over his head, and walked over to my desk. Pastor Williams had just delivered a crushing dose of spiritual reality to my parents, but I knew my sister and her husband needed a much more tangible reminder that their time was rapidly running out. Chantel was still wrapped in her expensive cashmere blanket downstairs, whining loudly about the cold, but she still had running water and access to the localized power outlets in the East Wing guest suite. It was time to completely sever their final lifelines to comfort. I picked up my tablet and opened the master utility management application for the estate. When I purchased the property 5 years ago, I had specialized contractors install a commercial-grade sub-panel system, specifically so I could isolate and control different zones of the massive house. I navigated to the directory and selected the East Wing guest suite. With 2 deliberate taps on the glowing screen, I completely severed the electrical current to their specific rooms. Next, I accessed the smart plumbing controls and engaged the shut-off protocol for the main water valve leading to their ensuite bathroom. There would be no hot showers, no charging their dead cell phones, and absolutely no luxury for their final night under my roof. Less than 5 minutes later, I heard Preston storming down the upstairs hallway. He was shouting profanities, his heavy footsteps thudding aggressively against the hardwood floorboards. He yelled down the stairs to Chantel that I had maliciously blown a fuse and that he was going to the basement to fix it himself. I opened the security camera application on my tablet and switched to the feed from the utility room. I watched closely as Preston marched down the concrete basement steps, using the weak flashlight on his cellular phone to navigate the dim lighting. He walked straight up to the main heavy-duty electrical panel mounted on the far concrete wall. This was not a simple residential breaker box. It was a complex, high-voltage system designed to handle the massive square footage of the entire estate. Preston aggressively ripped the gray metal door open. He stood there for a long moment, staring blankly at the intimidating grid of thick wires, heavy-duty switches, and smart relays. A rational man would have immediately realized he was completely out of his depth and walked away. But Preston was driven by pure toxic ego. He absolutely refused to be bested by a black woman he viewed as nothing more than a glorified calculator. He marched over to my father's old dusty workbench, grabbed a heavy steel wrench and a pair of worn insulated pliers, and stomped back to the open panel. I watched the digital screen in absolute disbelief as he began blindly ripping at the secondary wiring. He was aggressively trying to manually bypass the smart relays I had locked remotely from my tablet. He was treating a 200-amp live electrical panel like a broken toy he could just force into working. I stood up from my desk chair, ready to run down there and stop him before he completely electrocuted himself. But I was too late. On the camera feed, Preston jammed the heavy metal wrench directly across two live electrical terminals. A massive blinding shower of blue and white sparks exploded from the box. Preston screamed and jumped back, dropping the metal tools onto the concrete floor as a sharp, violent popping sound echoed all the way up to the second floor of the house. A thick, ominous cloud of acrid black smoke immediately began billowing from the ruined electrical panel. Within seconds, the piercing, deafening shriek of the fire alarms began blaring throughout the entire estate. The harsh smell of melting plastic and scorched copper wire quickly crept up the staircase and flooded the upper hallway. I did not hesitate for a single second. I grabbed my phone-pulled tray from the bed and dialed 911. I calmly and clearly informed the emergency dispatcher that there was an active electrical fire in my basement caused by a hostile trespasser who was actively vandalizing the property. I wrapped Trey in his heavy winter coat, grabbed my own jacket, and hurried him down the stairs and out the front door into the freezing November night air. My parents and Chantel were already rushing out onto the front driveway, coughing heavily and panicking as the smoke alarms continued their relentless screaming from inside the house. A moment later, Preston emerged from the side door of the garage. His face and hands were covered in dark black soot, and he was coughing violently. He looked completely unhinged, staring wildly at the smoke drifting out of the open side door. Less than 3 minutes later, the loud, piercing wail of emergency sirens filled our quiet suburban street. A massive red fire engine and 2 local police cruisers swerved aggressively into my long driveway, their flashing blue and red lights throwing chaotic shadows across the panicked faces of my family. 2 heavily geared firefighters immediately rushed past us with heavy extinguishers, heading straight for the basement entrance, while 2 police officers stepped out of their cruisers, resting their hands cautiously on their duty belts. Seeing the police arrive, Preston immediately went into his corporate survival mode. He frantically wiped the dark soot from his forehead, stood up straight, and marched confidently toward the approaching officers. He was banking entirely on his perceived privilege, assuming that as a white man in a tailored shirt, the police would naturally defer to his authority. He held his hands up in a calming professional gesture and put on his best fake executive voice. He told the officers that everything was perfectly under control and that it was just a minor household accident with a faulty breaker. He confidently introduced himself, acting as though he owned the entire estate and was simply managing a nuisance. He turned and pointed a soot-stained finger directly at me, where I was standing quietly near the edge of the lawn holding my son's hand. Preston told the police officers that his sister-in-law was having a severe mental breakdown and had been dangerously tampering with the house utilities all night. He claimed with a straight face that I was a physical danger to his pregnant wife and the rest of the family, and he politely requested that they formally escort me off his property before I caused any more structural damage. The older of the 2 police officers, a tall man with a stern, unreadable expression, listened patiently to Preston's entire fabricated speech. He nodded slowly, pulling a small black notepad from his uniform pocket. He calmly asked Preston for his full legal name and a state-issued identification card to verify his official residency at the address. Preston smirked confidently, reaching into his wallet and handing over his driver's license, fully expecting the officer to immediately march over and arrest me. The officer glanced down at the plastic card, then lifted his shoulder radio to contact the central dispatch. He requested a full background check on the name and asked dispatch to pull the official county property records for the address. We all stood there in the freezing cold for 2 agonizing minutes. My father was clutching his chest, absolutely terrified of the police presence at his former home. My mother was silently weeping into her hands. Chantel was shivering violently in her blanket, watching her husband try to smooth talk his way out of an active felony. Then the police radio on the officer's shoulder crackled loudly to life. The dispatcher's voice rang out clear and sharp into the cold night air, confirming that the property was exclusively owned by a private commercial trust managed entirely by Kendra, and that there were absolutely no other registered tenants on file. The officer slowly handed the driver's license back to Preston. He did not smile. He looked at Preston's ruined, soot-covered clothes and then looked directly over at me. I stepped forward into the flashing lights, pulling my own state identification and a digital copy of the certified property deed on my phone, presenting them clearly to the officer. The officer thoroughly verified my information, nodded respectfully to me, and turned his attention back to the man who had just blatantly lied to his face. Preston opened his mouth desperately, trying to spin another rapid lie about verbal leases, family agreements, and missing paperwork. The officer simply raised a heavy gloved hand, cutting him off completely. He looked Preston up and down, taking in the pathetic, ruined reality of the fake tech investor. "Sir," the officer said, his voice hard and entirely devoid of any sympathy, "step away from the house immediately. The actual homeowner wants to press charges against you for vandalism." Preston did not even have the chance to formulate another lie. The tall officer stepped forward, grabbed Preston by his expensive tailored shoulder, and spun him around with practiced efficiency. He forced Preston to place his hands flat against the side of the police cruiser. The sudden violent reality of the situation finally shattered Preston's arrogant facade. He gasped, his eyes wide with genuine panic, completely abandoning his fake corporate executive persona. He began to beg, his voice cracking, as he pleaded with the officers, claiming it was all a huge misunderstanding and that he was just trying to fix a simple fuse. The officer ignored his frantic rambling. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around Preston's wrists echoed loudly in the freezing night air. The officer began reading Preston his Miranda rights in a calm, flat tone, completely unaffected by the desperate man squirming in his grip. That was the exact moment Chantel's fragile reality completely snapped. She threw off her heavy cashmere blanket and ran barefoot across the freezing driveway, screaming her husband's name. She lunged at the police officer, her hands clawing desperately at his uniform jacket, trying to physically pull him away from Preston. The second officer immediately stepped in, grabbing Chantel by the shoulders and pulling her back forcefully. He issued a stern, loud warning, telling her that if she did not step back immediately, she would be joining her husband in the back of the squad car for assaulting a police officer. Chantel collapsed onto the cold concrete of the driveway, completely hysterical. She began sobbing violently, her chest heaving as she wailed into the night. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears and mascara, and screamed that I was an absolute monster. She yelled that I was destroying her family, that her unborn baby was going to suffer, and that she would never forgive me for this. She acted as though I had forced her husband to steal my father's retirement fund and smash a wrench into a high-voltage electrical panel. I did not say a word to her. I stood quietly with my son, shielding him from the chaos. I looked past Chantel and saw my parents standing on the manicured front lawn. They were completely paralyzed. The flashing red and blue lights from the emergency vehicles were illuminating the faces of dozens of our neighbors who had stepped out onto their porches to watch the spectacle. For my father, a man who worshipped his public image, this was a fate worse than death. The entire affluent neighborhood was currently watching his golden son-in-law being stuffed into the back of a police cruiser like a common criminal. The firefighters emerged from the basement, informing the police that the electrical fire was extinguished, but that the main panel was completely destroyed. They officially tagged the basement as a hazard zone. The tall police officer walked over to my father. He pointed a stern finger at him and delivered a final, uncompromising warning. He stated that the fire department had confirmed the property damage, and that Preston was being booked for felony vandalism and reckless endangerment. The officer then looked directly at my parents and Chantel, reminding them that they had been legally served a 24-hour verbal eviction notice by the verified property owner. He promised them that if they were not completely off the premises by tomorrow evening, he would personally return with a team to arrest them all for criminal trespassing. Without another word, the officers got into their cruisers and drove away, taking the great tech investor straight to the county jail. The fire engine followed shortly after, leaving my family standing in the freezing driveway, bathed only in the cold light of the street lamps. I did not wait for them to process their humiliation. I took Trey by the hand, walked past my shivering sister and my frozen parents, and went back inside the house. I locked the heavy front door behind me. I escorted my son upstairs to my bedroom, tucked him into my bed, and assured him that the loud noises were over and that he was completely safe. I waited until his breathing slowed and he finally drifted off to sleep. The house was incredibly quiet, but it was a tense, suffocating silence. The east wing was now completely devoid of power and running water. The temperature inside was dropping rapidly. I sat in the darkness of my room, listening carefully. I knew my family. I knew that desperation breeds absolute sheer audacity, and they were officially out of legal and social options. It was just past midnight when I heard the faint, distinct creak of the floorboards in my master suite hallway. I did not move immediately. I sat perfectly still in the leather chair by the window, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The footsteps were light, stealthy, and entirely intentional. They were bypassing the main bedroom area and heading straight toward my private walk-in closet and dressing room. I stood up silently. I walked across the plush carpet, making absolutely no sound. I reached the open archway of my dressing room and stopped, leaning slightly against the door frame to look inside. There, illuminated by the harsh, narrow beam of a small smartphone flashlight, was my mother. Brenda was frantically digging through the top drawers of my built-in mahogany dresser. Her normally perfect hair was a mess, and her hands were shaking violently as she tossed my silk scarves and personal items onto the floor. She was completely frantic, operating purely on survival instinct. I watched quietly as she finally found what she was looking for. She pulled out a heavy, intricately carved wooden box. It was my late grandmother's antique jewelry box. My grandmother had left it exclusively to me in her will because I was the only grandchild who actually spent time with her during her final years in hospice. Inside that box was a collection of vintage diamond rings, a heavy gold necklace, and a pair of emerald earrings that had been in our family for 4 generations. The pieces were worth tens of thousands of dollars. My mother clutched the heavy wooden box to her chest, letting out a ragged sigh of relief. She turned off her flashlight, preparing to sneak back out of my room with the stolen heirlooms. I reached out and flicked the bright overhead light switch. The dressing room flooded with sudden blinding light. My mother shrieked, jumping backward and dropping her phone onto the hardwood floor. She clutched the jewelry box tighter against her chest, her eyes wide with sheer terror as she stared at me standing in the doorway. I looked at the woman who had spent her entire life demanding my respect and unconditional loyalty. She was standing in my closet in the middle of the night, caught red-handed trying to rob me blind. I kept my voice dangerously low so I would not wake my son. I asked her exactly what she thought she was doing. Brenda swallowed hard, backing up until she hit the edge of the dresser. She tried to quickly arrange her face into a mask of maternal authority, completely ignoring the fact that she had just been caught stealing. She jutted her chin out and told me that she was taking the jewelry because the family needed it. She spoke with an incredible toxic entitlement. She said that Preston was sitting in a freezing jail cell and that Chantel was downstairs having a nervous breakdown. She declared that she needed to pawn the heirloom diamonds tomorrow morning to pay for Preston's bail bond and to hire a defense attorney to fight my ridiculous eviction. She actually looked me in the eye and tried to justify her theft. She told me that I was a cold-hearted, selfish woman who did not deserve to wear my grandmother's diamonds. She claimed that because I was actively destroying the family, I had forfeited my right to the family heirlooms. She told me to step aside and let her leave the room, acting as though she was performing a noble sacrifice for the greater good of the household. She truly believed that her position as the matriarch gave her the absolute right to plunder my personal property to save her golden child's criminal husband. She expected me to feel guilty. She expected me to bow my head and allow her to walk out of my room with my inheritance. I did not move a single inch. I stood directly in the center of the doorway, completely blocking her only exit. I looked at the heavy wooden box clutched desperately in her hands, and I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the exact same clinical, calculating smile I used when a corporate audit revealed a massive, undeniable fraud. I kept my smile fixed in place as my mother stood there, trembling in the bright light of the walk-in closet. She was clutching the wooden box like a life preserver, desperately trying to maintain her moral high ground while caught in the middle of a late-night burglary. When her initial burst of entitlement failed to make me step aside, she seamlessly transitioned into her secondary weapon. She began to cry. They were not tears of genuine remorse. They were the calculated theatrical tears she had used for decades to manipulate my father to secure sympathy from the church and to excuse every terrible thing my sister had ever done. Brenda let her shoulders slump, her face crumbling into a mask of pure maternal agony. She hugged the jewelry box tighter and began to sob, telling me that I simply did not understand the heavy burden of being a mother to a girl like Chantel. She cried out that Chantel was incredibly fragile. She used that word specifically, weaponizing it as she always did. She claimed that Chantel was delicate, sensitive, and completely unprepared for the harsh realities of the world, especially now that she was pregnant and her husband was sitting in a freezing county jail cell. She looked at me with red, tear-filled eyes and told me that I had always been so tough, so independent, and so incredibly cold-hearted. She said I was a machine who only cared about numbers and property deeds, and that I lacked the basic human empathy required to understand why a mother would do absolutely anything to protect her weakest child. She begged me to just let her walk out the door. She promised she would only pawn the grandmother's necklace, and that she would eventually pay me back once Preston's legal troubles were sorted out, and his non-existent investments paid off. She told me that if I truly loved my family, I would look the other way and let her save my sister from a complete mental collapse. I listened to her entire performance without blinking. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I had spent my entire childhood being called cold-hearted simply because I refused to be emotionally manipulated. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out my smartphone. I looked at her and said that it was truly touching to hear her speak about maternal sacrifice. I told her that she was absolutely right about one thing. A mother will do anything to fund her golden child's lifestyle. I unlocked my screen, opened my secure audio files, and told her that we needed to take a quick trip down memory lane. I selected a specific audio file I had been saving for exactly 2 years. I turned the volume all the way up and pressed play. The audio was crisp and clear, echoing loudly off the custom wooden shelving of my dressing room. It was a recorded phone call. My mother's voice filled the room, but it was not the weeping, fragile voice she was currently using. It was brisk, confident, and highly deceitful. She was speaking to an associate at a predatory high-interest payday loan company based out of Nevada. On the recording, the loan officer asked to confirm the applicant's identity for a $25,000 personal line of credit. My mother confidently stated my full legal name. She then proceeded to rattle off my exact date of birth, my current address, and my complete 9-digit social security number without missing a single beat. The loan officer then asked what the funds would be used for, and my mother cheerfully explained that the money was needed to secure the deposit for a luxury destination wedding in Cabo San Lucas. I paused the recording right there. The silence that followed was deafening. The fake tears completely vanished from my mother's face, replaced by a look of absolute unadulterated horror. She was staring at my phone as if it were a venomous snake. I looked her dead in the eye and explained that as a forensic accountant, I maintain active real-time monitoring on all of my personal credit profiles. I told her that 2 years ago, right when Chantel was bragging to the entire extended family about how Preston was paying for her lavish Mexican beach wedding out of pocket, I received a sudden hard inquiry alert on my credit report. I investigated the ping, contacted the predatory lender directly, and legally obtained the verification recording under the guise of an active identity theft investigation. I took a step closer to her, invading her space, just as she had invaded my private sanctuary. I told her that she had actively tried to commit federal identity theft, attempting to saddle me with a $25,000 high-interest loan that would have absolutely ruined my credit, all so her fragile daughter could have ice sculptures and imported champagne on a beach in Mexico. I told her that the only reason she was not standing in a courtroom facing felony fraud charges 2 years ago was because I had personally intervened, canceled the application, and chosen to keep her dirty little secret to protect my father's fragile heart. My mother opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She was hyperventilating, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The illusion of the noble self-sacrificing mother had just been completely incinerated. She was exposed for exactly what she was. A common thief who was perfectly willing to destroy one daughter's future to fund the other daughter's delusions. She looked down at the heavy wooden jewelry box in her hands. In her desperate, panicked mind, she thought this box was her only remaining ticket out of the nightmare she was currently trapped in. She gripped the brass latch tightly, her knuckles white. She looked back up at me, her eyes darting wildly, silently calculating if she could somehow push past me and run down the stairs with the diamonds before I could stop her. I saw the desperate calculation in her eyes. I smiled again, a slow, dark smile that made her freeze in place. I raised my hand and gestured toward the box. I told her to go ahead and open it. I said that if she was truly willing to commit a burglary in my house after getting caught committing identity theft on tape, she should at least check the merchandise first. Brenda stared at me suspiciously. Her shaking fingers fumbled with the small brass latch. She flipped the heavy wooden lid open. Inside, resting on the faded blue velvet lining, were the familiar pieces: the heavy gold chain, the large diamond solitaire ring, and the glittering emerald earrings. To the untrained eye, they looked exactly like the priceless family heirlooms my grandmother had worn for decades. My mother let out a small breath of relief seeing that her prize was still intact. I completely shattered her relief with my next sentence. I told her that they were exceptionally good replicas. I explained that I had contracted a specialized jeweler in downtown Seattle to recreate my grandmother's entire collection using gold-plated brass and high-grade cubic zirconia. I told her that the entire box she was holding so desperately was worth absolutely nothing. My mother's eyes widened in shock. She reached down and picked up the diamond solitaire ring, holding it up to the harsh overhead light of the closet, desperately trying to see the truth. I kept my voice cold and clinical. I explained that I had known exactly who she was the moment I caught her trying to steal my identity 2 years ago. I knew that living in this house with a family of financial parasites meant nothing I owned was truly safe. So 6 months ago, when I noticed Preston lingering a little too closely around my private rooms, I packed up the real diamonds, the real gold, and the genuine emeralds. I drove them down to a secure, climate-controlled vault at my private bank, where they currently sat behind 2 feet of solid steel and a biometric security system. I looked at the woman who had brought me into this world. She was standing in a freezing house, clutching a box of worthless fake stones, her golden son-in-law sitting in a jail cell, her husband exposed as a degenerate gambler, and her own identity theft recorded perfectly on my phone. I told her that she was welcome to take the fake jewelry to the pawn shop tomorrow morning. I said the broker might give her $50 for the cubic zirconia, which would barely cover the cost of a taxi ride to the county jail to visit Preston. I finally stepped aside, leaving the doorway completely open. I gestured toward the dark hallway. I told my mother to put the worthless box back on my dresser and get out of my room before I called the police officers back to arrest her for attempted burglary. My mother stared at the open doorway, her face pale and her breathing shallow. She looked down at the wooden box of cubic zirconia in her hands, the fake jewels sparkling mockingly under the bright closet lights. The absolute certainty that she had been utterly defeated finally washed over her. She did not say another word. She slowly lowered the box, placing it back onto the velvet lining of the dresser drawer. She turned around and shuffled out of my master suite, her shoulders completely slumped, looking 10 years older than when she had sneaked in. I waited until I heard her footsteps retreat all the way down the hall before I quietly shut my bedroom door and engaged the heavy deadbolt. I managed to get a few hours of sleep, my mind constantly calculating the next steps of the eviction process. When the sun finally began to rise, casting a pale, cold light through my bedroom window, the house was entirely silent. I got out of bed dressed in a sharp, tailored blazer and slacks and woke my son. I helped Trey put on a thick sweater, knowing the rest of the house would still be freezing since I had not restored the central heating. I told him we were going to go downstairs, have a quick breakfast, and then I was going to take him over to his best friend's house for a play date, so he would not have to witness the ugly reality of what was coming next. I walked down the sweeping oak staircase with Trey, my leather briefcase securely in my hand. The main floor was like a tomb. The air was frigid. I guided Trey into the kitchen and began making him a bowl of warm oatmeal, turning on the espresso machine for myself. Through the open archway, I could see Chantel lying on the living room sofa. She was buried under a pile of heavy blankets, her eyes puffy and red from crying all night. She glared at me as I poured my coffee, but she did not have the energy to scream. My mother was nowhere to be seen, likely hiding in her dark, unheated bedroom, paralyzed by the shame of last night's confrontation. It was just past 8 in the morning when I heard the heavy sound of a car engine pulling aggressively into the driveway. A moment later, the front door swung open and slammed shut with incredible force. Heavy, confident footsteps echoed across the marble foyer. I stood in the kitchen taking a slow sip of my black coffee, waiting. My father marched through the archway and into the kitchen. He was not wearing the wrinkled clothes from last night. He was dressed in his finest Sunday suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his expensive leather shoes polished to a high shine. The pathetic, weeping man who had fallen to his knees on the living room rug and begged Pastor Williams for forgiveness was completely gone. In his place stood the arrogant, image-obsessed patriarch I had dealt with my entire life. He looked completely revitalized. He had a smug, victorious grin plastered across his face, and his chest was puffed out with an overwhelming sense of restored authority. He walked directly up to the granite kitchen island. He did not look at his grandson. He looked straight at me, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. He raised his right hand and slammed a thick manila envelope down onto the countertop right next to my coffee cup. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the granite, and ordered me to walk over to the utility panel and turn the power back on immediately. He used his booming, authoritative voice, the one designed to make people shrink and obey without question. He told me to start making Chantel a hot breakfast because absolutely nobody was leaving this house today, tomorrow, or ever. I did not flinch. I took another sip of my coffee, set the mug down, and looked calmly at the manila envelope. I asked him exactly what he thought he had accomplished by putting on a suit and yelling in my kitchen. My father let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He stood up straight and proudly announced that Preston was not the helpless fool I thought he was. He explained that Preston had used his legally mandated phone call from the county jail holding cell not to call Chantel, but to contact his high-powered legal team downtown. My father claimed that Preston's lawyers had worked through the night, waking up a county judge at dawn to review the details of my so-called illegal eviction. He reached out, ripped open the flap of the manila envelope, and pulled out a stack of freshly printed legal documents. He slapped them down on the counter, spreading them out so I could see the blue county court stamps and the judge's signature at the bottom. My father pointed a triumphant finger at the paperwork and declared that Preston's lawyer had found a massive legal loophole. He told me that I had made a fatal mistake by trying to throw a pregnant woman out into the cold. He stated that the judge had officially granted an emergency stay of eviction, issuing a temporary restraining order that completely blocked my 24-hour notice. He smirked a nasty, condescending look that mirrored Preston's exact expression from the Thanksgiving table. He leaned in close and told me that the law protects vulnerable tenants from predatory landlords. He said that a judge will never allow an emergency eviction of a pregnant woman if she has an established legally binding right to the property. I looked down at the court documents. My forensic accounting training kicked in instantly. I did not see a victory. I saw a puzzle with missing pieces. I kept my voice perfectly level and asked him what established right he was talking about, considering none of them had ever signed a lease or paid a single dime in rent to my commercial trust. My father's smile grew even wider, stretching across his face in a display of pure toxic arrogance. He told me that I must have forgotten the paperwork I signed when I bought the house. He confidently declared that Preston had filed a certified copy of the lifetime lease agreement I had authorized for Chantel 3 years ago. He claimed that the document guaranteed Chantel and her family the absolute right to reside in the east wing of the estate, rent-free for the rest of her natural life, and that no landlord, not even the property owner, could override a lifetime residential lease without a massive years-long legal battle in the state Supreme Court. I stared at him in complete silence. My mind processed his words with clinical precision. I had never drafted a lifetime lease. I had never signed a lifetime lease. I had specifically established the blind trust to ensure that absolutely no one in my family had any legal claim or documented right to the property. There was no paperwork. There were no agreements. The realization hit me like a bolt of lightning, sharp and perfectly clear. Preston had not called a high-powered corporate lawyer from his jail cell. He had called a cheap, shady bail bondsman or a corrupt paralegal. More importantly, Preston had somehow managed to digitally fabricate a commercial lease agreement complete with my forged signature and my trust's corporate information. He had submitted a completely fraudulent manufactured document to a sitting county judge to secure this emergency injunction. My father was standing in my kitchen gloating over what he believed was a masterstroke of legal genius. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that he was proudly holding the physical evidence of a massive federal crime. He tapped his finger against the forged document. He told me that I was completely trapped. He said that if I tried to lock the doors, cut the water, or call the police to remove them tonight, the officers would arrest me for violating a direct court order. He commanded me to hand over the administrative passwords for the smart home system right this second. He thought he had outsmarted me. He thought he had used the legal system to put the ungrateful, rebellious daughter back in her rightful place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. I looked from the forged documents up to my father's smug, triumphant face. I did not feel defeated. I felt the cold, thrilling certainty of an absolute checkmate. I picked up my coffee mug, taking one final leisurely sip before preparing to burn their entire fabricated world completely to the ground. I set my coffee mug down on the cool granite countertop and reached out to pick up the stack of legal documents my father had just slapped in front of me. I did not snatch them angrily. I handled them with the clinical precision of a forensic accountant examining a piece of raw evidence. My father stood on the other side of the kitchen island, his arms crossed over his chest, a smug grin plastered across his face. He truly believed he was watching my absolute defeat. I scanned the first page of the supposed lifetime lease agreement. It took my trained eyes less than 5 seconds to identify the first massive red flag. The document claimed to have been executed 3 years ago, but the corporate letterhead at the top of the page featured a specific formatting style that my limited liability company had only adopted 8 months ago. Preston had not even bothered to find an old template. He had simply downloaded a recent invoice from my company website and clumsily copy-pasted the header onto a generic lease agreement. I flipped to the signature page. I stared at my own name, supposedly signed in blue ink at the bottom of the document. It was a remarkably good forgery to the untrained eye, but it was incredibly lazy. Preston had traced my signature from a public tax filing I submitted in 2019. I knew this because in 2019, my pen had slipped slightly on the final letter of my last name, creating a tiny, distinct loop that I never repeated again. Preston had copied the error perfectly. Furthermore, the notary seal stamped next to my fake signature belonged to a public notary whose license had officially expired 4 years ago. I knew that because she was the woman who originally notarized the blind trust, and she had retired and moved to Florida shortly after. Preston had not just forged a simple document. He had committed perjury, manufactured fraudulent commercial records, and submitted them to a sitting county judge to secure a court order under completely false pretenses. He had crossed the line from a desperate family dispute straight into severe federal felony territory. My father leaned across the counter, completely misinterpreting my silence. He told me that I could stare at the papers all day long, but it would not change the fact that I was legally paralyzed. He commanded me to hand over the smart home passwords again, warning me that if the house was not fully heated within the next 10 minutes, he was going to call the police and have me arrested for violating the emergency injunction. I looked up from the forged papers. I did not argue with him. I did not point out the retired notary or the copied signature. Explaining the law to a man who lived entirely in delusion was a complete waste of my breath. I neatly tapped the edges of the forged documents against the granite countertop, aligning the pages perfectly. I slid them back into the manila envelope. I handed the envelope back to my father. I kept my voice incredibly calm, completely devoid of any anger or panic. I told him that he was right. I said that if a judge had signed the emergency stay, then my hands were officially tied. I told him to go ahead and make himself comfortable and that I would go upstairs and adjust the climate controls right away. My father let out a loud, booming laugh of pure triumph. He snatched the envelope from my hand, his chest puffing out even further. He told me it was about time I learned my place and respected the hierarchy of this family. He turned his back on me and confidently marched out of the kitchen, heading toward the living room to deliver the glorious news of his victory to my mother and Chantel. I did not go to the smart home control panel. I walked straight up the stairs, went into my private home office, and locked the heavy solid wood door behind me. I sat down at my glass desk and opened my secure encrypted work laptop. As a licensed forensic accountant, I had direct access to reporting channels that the average citizen did not even know existed. I was not going to waste my time calling a local family attorney to fight a temporary restraining order in county civil court. That would take weeks, and it would give Preston time to cover his tracks or flee the state. I was going to use the nuclear option. I pulled up the encrypted digital dossier I had received from my private investigator last night. I arranged the files meticulously on my dual monitors. On the left screen, I had the undeniable proof that Preston had drained my father's retirement accounts to cover illegal cryptocurrency margin calls. On the right screen, I uploaded high-resolution scans of the forged lifetime lease agreement my father had just proudly handed me. I picked up my office phone and dialed a direct, unlisted number for the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. I did not get a receptionist or an automated menu. The line rang twice before a federal agent answered. I introduced myself using my full legal name and immediately provided my state-certified forensic accounting license number to establish my professional credibility. I informed the agent that I was officially reporting a massive case of wire fraud, tax evasion, and federal perjury. I explained that the suspect, Preston, had recently filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy to dodge $80,000 in tax liabilities while simultaneously siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars across state lines into unregulated offshore crypto exchanges. The agent's tone shifted instantly from routine to highly alert. He asked if I had documentary evidence to support these claims. I told him I had a complete time-stamped financial trail, including unauthorized bank withdrawals and forged digital signatures used to empty a senior citizen's pension fund. I securely transmitted the encrypted dossier directly to his official government email address while we were still on the phone. I heard the clicking of his keyboard as he opened the files. Within 60 seconds, the agent confirmed that the documentation was more than enough to trigger an immediate catastrophic federal audit and a potential flight risk detention. But I was not finished. As soon as I disconnected from the Internal Revenue Service, I made my second phone call. This time I contacted the regional field office of the United States Marshals Service. The local police had arrested Preston last night for simple vandalism, a state-level misdemeanor that he could easily post bail for. I needed to ensure that when he walked out of that county jail, he walked straight into federal custody. I spoke to the duty officer and reported the forged commercial lease agreement. I explained that a suspect currently sitting in county lockup had actively manufactured fraudulent corporate documents across state lines and submitted them to a local judge to secure an illegal injunction. Because my limited liability company was registered in Delaware and the property was located here, his forgery constituted a federal crime of interstate commerce manipulation. I provided the duty officer with Preston's exact location at the county detention center. I informed them that his bail hearing was likely scheduled for this morning and that if they did not intercept him, a major flight risk, involved in a massive wire fraud investigation, would be released back onto the streets. The duty officer took down every single detail, confirming that they were cross-referencing my report with the active fraud investigation I had just initiated with the IRS. They assured me that agents were being dispatched immediately to coordinate with the local county sheriff. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair. The house below me was completely quiet. My father was probably sitting in the freezing living room right now, holding his forged court order, fully believing he had secured his kingdom for the rest of his life. He had no idea that I had just weaponized the entire federal government against his golden son-in-law. I looked at the digital clock on my computer monitor. It was exactly 9 in the morning. Preston was a man who loved to manipulate numbers and legal documents to destroy other people. Now he was about to find out what happens when you try to forge documents against a woman whose entire career is built on burying financial criminals under a mountain of undeniable proof. I simply had to wait for the moving trucks to arrive. I spent the rest of the day barricaded in my home office, ignoring the heavy pounding on my door, as my father demanded I restore the central heating and hand over the smart home administrative passwords. I let them suffer through another freezing night. By the time the sun rose the following morning, the atmosphere inside the house was a volatile mixture of bitter cold and toxic arrogance. My father had managed to scrape together enough cash from a high-interest title loan to bail Preston out of the county jail late the previous afternoon. When Preston had returned to the house, he looked entirely pathetic, smelling of cheap institutional soap and covered in soot from the electrical fire. But the moment my father showed him the forged court injunction, Preston's insufferable condescending confidence had instantly returned. They had spent the entire night huddled in the freezing living room, wrapped in thick blankets, loudly making plans for how they were going to completely remodel my master suite once the courts forced me out. I stood by the large bay window in my bedroom, sipping a fresh cup of coffee, looking out over the frost-covered front lawn. I was waiting for the exact sequence of events I had orchestrated to finally unfold. Exactly at 9 o'clock, the deep vibrating rumble of a heavy diesel engine shook the quiet suburban street. A massive 26-foot commercial moving truck turned slowly into my long driveway. The air brakes hissed loudly as the heavy vehicle rolled to a stop right in front of the main portico, completely blocking the front entrance of the estate. Two burly movers in matching uniforms jumped out of the cab and lowered the heavy steel ramp at the back of the truck. Hearing the commotion, my family immediately rushed out of the house and gathered on the front porch. I picked up my leather briefcase, walked calmly down the stairs, and stepped out the front door to join them in the freezing morning air. My father was wearing his expensive winter coat over his pajamas, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. When he saw the moving truck, his face broke into a massive triumphant grin. He turned to look at me, letting out a loud, booming laugh that echoed across the frost-covered lawn. He proudly declared that it was incredibly smart of me to finally accept reality and surrender. He pointed a gloved finger at the moving truck and told me to instruct the workers to start packing up the master suite immediately. He bragged to my mother and Chantel, saying that the sheer power of the legal system had finally put the ungrateful daughter right back in her place. He told me that if I hurried up and cleared my belongings out by noon, he might generously decide not to press charges against me for shutting off the power to the guest wing. Preston stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with my father. He shoved his hands into his pockets and gave me that familiar, sickeningly smug smirk. He used his soft, patronizing corporate voice, telling me that fighting against real wealth and real legal power was a game I was never going to win. He told me to consider this a harsh but necessary life lesson in respecting the family hierarchy. Chantel chimed in from the doorway, whining that the movers needed to be extremely careful not to scratch the hardwood floors because her imported Italian cribs were scheduled to be delivered by the end of the week. I stood on the porch feeling the cold wind against my face and took a slow sip of my coffee. I looked at the four of them, completely blinded by their own delusion, celebrating a victory built entirely on a forged piece of paper. I kept my voice perfectly level and completely devoid of emotion. I told my father that the moving truck was not here for me. I reminded him that I had issued a 24-hour eviction notice on Thanksgiving, and since they had flatly refused to pack their own bags, I had hired a professional crew to haul their garbage to the curb. My father scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes as if I were a stubborn child throwing a pointless tantrum. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the manila envelope containing the forged lifetime lease and the fake emergency injunction. He shook the envelope aggressively in my direction. He yelled that I was completely delusional, reminding me that he had a signed order from a county judge that made them legally untouchable. I did not answer him. I simply looked past his shoulder, staring straight down the length of the driveway. Directly behind the massive moving truck, 3 unmarked heavy-duty black SUVs turned aggressively off the main street. They did not park neatly. They swerved onto the frost-covered grass, completely boxing the moving truck in and blocking any possible exit from the property. The smug laughter instantly died in my father's throat. Preston froze, his arrogant smirk melting off his face like hot wax. Hidden red and blue strobe lights suddenly flared to life inside the grilles and windshields of the black vehicles, casting harsh, flashing shadows across the front of the house. The heavy doors of the SUVs flew open in perfect unison. A dozen men and women stepped out into the freezing air. They were not local beat cops responding to a noise complaint. Half of them were wearing heavy tactical vests with the words U.S. Marshal printed in bold yellow letters across their chests. The others were dressed in sharp, nondescript business suits, wearing badges on heavy silver chains around their necks that identified them as special agents for the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Pulling up right behind the federal convoy were two marked county sheriff cruisers, bringing the local authorities to assist in the federal raid. The absolute shock that washed over my family was visceral. My mother let out a terrified gasp, stumbling backward until she hit the brick wall of the house. Chantel clamped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with unadulterated panic, as heavily armed federal agents quickly secured the perimeter of the driveway. My father, completely unable to process the total collapse of his reality, desperately tried to maintain his patriarchal authority. He stepped off the porch and walked toward the approaching agents, waving the manila envelope in the air. He put on his best community leader voice, attempting to take control of the situation. He loudly announced to the federal marshals that there had been a terrible misunderstanding. He claimed that he was the head of the household and that he had a valid court order protecting his family from an illegal eviction. He pointed an accusing finger back at me, telling the agents that they needed to arrest me for harassing his pregnant daughter. The lead federal marshal, a broad-shouldered man with cold, unblinking eyes, did not even slow his pace. He walked right past my father as if he were entirely invisible, completely ignoring the forged documents waving in the air. The marshal stopped at the bottom of the porch stairs. He looked directly past Chantel. He looked directly past my weeping mother. His sharp gaze locked entirely onto Preston, who was now trembling so violently he looked like he was going to collapse right there on the concrete steps. The marshal reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a thick stack of official federal warrants, heavily stamped and signed by a United States District Court judge. The smugness, the arrogance, and the entitlement that had fueled my family's abuse for decades vanished completely into the freezing morning air, replaced by the crushing, undeniable weight of absolute ruin. The lead federal marshal looked directly at Preston, his voice cutting sharply through the cold morning air. He stated Preston's full legal name and announced that he was being placed under federal arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and interstate financial crimes. Preston stumbled backward, his designer shoes slipping slightly on the frost-covered concrete. He raised his hands in a frantic defensive gesture, stammering that there was a massive mistake. He pointed a shaking finger at my father, desperately telling the marshal that they had a signed court order from a county judge that proved this was all just a local civil dispute over property. My father, still clinging to his delusion, aggressively shoved the manila envelope toward the federal agent. He loudly declared that the document was a certified lifetime lease and an emergency injunction demanding that the marshal step off his property immediately. I walked calmly down the porch steps and stopped right next to the lead marshal. I looked at my father and gently pulled the manila envelope from his trembling grip. I handed the documents directly to the federal agent. I kept my voice clinical and precise, perfectly suited for an active crime scene. I informed the marshal that the suspect had manufactured those documents less than 12 hours ago. I explained that Preston had digitally copied my signature from a 2019 tax filing, complete with a distinct pen slip on the final letter of my last name. I then pointed to the notary stamp at the bottom of the page. I told the federal agents that the notary public listed on that document had officially retired and surrendered her license 4 years ago, making the seal a complete fabrication. The lead marshal inspected the paperwork for exactly 3 seconds before nodding to his partner. The second agent immediately pulled a clear plastic evidence bag from his tactical vest and sealed the forged injunction inside. The marshal looked at Preston and stated that forging a commercial lease to manipulate a county judge was a severe federal offense, adding perjury and manufacturing fraudulent documents to his rapidly growing list of felony charges. Preston's mouth opened and closed silently. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. The absolute reality of federal prison was staring him right in the face. Chantel completely broke down. She grabbed Preston's arms, sobbing hysterically, begging him to say something to fix this. She cried out that they were wealthy investors, that they had a baby on the way, and that they needed to call their corporate lawyers downtown. She turned her tear-streaked face toward me and screamed that I was ruining her perfect life out of pure jealousy. I looked at my sister. For 32 years, she had paraded around acting as though she were inherently better than me, funded entirely by my parents' favoritism and her husband's lies. It was time to completely dismantle her fake reality. I told Chantel that her perfect life did not actually exist. I kept my tone perfectly even, delivering the facts with the surgical precision of an audit report. I told her that her husband was not a wealthy tech investor. He was a broke, desperate con artist who had filed for bankruptcy to avoid paying his taxes. Chantel shook her head violently, refusing to believe it. She yelled that I was a liar and that Preston had hundreds of thousands of dollars tied up in secure crypto portfolios. I took a step closer to her. I told her that Preston did have hundreds of thousands of dollars at one point, but none of it belonged to him. I explained that my private investigator and the Internal Revenue Service had spent the entire morning tracking Preston's offshore accounts. I dropped the final devastating bomb right on top of her. I told Chantel that 6 months ago, when Preston's crypto margins completely collapsed, he did not just drain our father's retirement fund. He went looking for more capital to burn. I looked her dead in the eye and informed her that Preston had secretly taken out a $400,000 second mortgage entirely in her name. Chantel stopped crying instantly. The air was completely sucked out of her lungs. She stared at me, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. I did not let her look away. I told her that Preston had forged her signature on the loan applications using her clean credit history to secure the massive debt. He had funneled every single penny into his failing investments, and he had lost absolutely all of it. I told Chantel that she did not own imported Italian cribs or custom nursery furniture. She owned nearly $500,000 in fraudulent federal debt, and her credit score was completely ruined for the rest of her natural life. Chantel slowly turned her head to look at her husband. Preston could not even meet her gaze. He stared at the frost-covered grass, his shoulders hunched, his silence serving as an absolute undeniable confession. My mother let out a loud, agonizing wail. Brenda rushed forward, wrapping her arms protectively around Chantel. She glared at Preston with pure venom, screaming that he was a monster for destroying her beautiful daughter's future. Brenda then turned to my father, tears streaming down her face. She grabbed his arm and begged him to do something, to use his connections to call the bank and fix this terrible mess. She pleaded with him to protect their golden child. But my father was completely silent. He was staring at the ground, sweating profusely in the freezing cold, looking incredibly small and terrified. I watched the pathetic scene unfold and decided it was time to shatter their toxic alliance permanently. I looked at my mother and told her she was begging the wrong man for help. I addressed the entire group, ensuring the federal agents heard every single word. I revealed that my father was not a victim in this specific tragedy. I explained the final piece of the forensic dossier I had received from the private investigator. I told my mother that my father had discovered Preston's theft an entire month ago. He had found the unauthorized bank transfers from his pension fund and confronted Preston in secret. My mother froze, her hands slowly dropping from my father's arm. She looked at him in absolute disbelief. I continued relentlessly. I told my mother that instead of calling the police, instead of warning his precious pregnant daughter that her husband was bankrupting her, my father chose to strike a deal with a criminal. I revealed that Preston had promised my father a massive $50,000 payout from a fake upcoming crypto settlement in exchange for his silence. My father had actively chosen to let his favorite daughter sink into $500,000 of fraudulent debt just to secure a phantom payday to fund his own gambling addiction. The silence that fell over the front lawn was deafening. The complete betrayal hung heavily in the freezing air. Brenda stared at the man she had been married to for nearly 40 years, the man she had enabled, protected, and worshipped. She realized in an instant that he had sold out their pregnant daughter for absolutely nothing. Brenda let out a sound that was half scream and half sob. She raised her hand and slapped my father directly across the face with incredible force. The sharp crack echoed loudly against the brick exterior of the house. My father stumbled sideways, clutching his cheek, but he did not dare say a word to defend himself. That was the exact moment Chantel completely snapped. The realization that her husband had stolen her identity and her father had actively let it happen completely broke her mind. She let out a primal, furious shriek and lunged directly at Preston. She did not care about the federal agents or the local police. She threw herself at him, her hands clawing desperately at his face and his expensive tailored jacket. She screamed that he had ruined her life, her baby's future, and her entire existence. Preston panicked. He was surrounded by federal marshals. His father-in-law was bleeding from the mouth, and his hysterical wife was actively tearing his clothes apart. The cowardice that had defined his entire life completely took over. Preston aggressively shoved his pregnant wife backward. Chantel stumbled and fell hard onto the frost-covered grass, crying out in shock. Seeing an opening, Preston turned and made a desperate, blinding dash toward the side gate leading to the back alley. He was running entirely on adrenaline, foolishly believing he could simply sprint away from a massive federal raid. He did not even make it 10 feet. The federal marshals moved with terrifying speed and precision. Two heavily armored agents launched themselves forward, tackling Preston directly around the waist. The impact was brutal. Preston hit the frozen ground face first, the heavy breath knocked completely out of his lungs. Before he could even attempt to struggle, the marshals had his arms pinned forcefully behind his back. The sharp, heavy metallic ratcheting sound of steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists signaled the absolute end of his pathetic empire. The lead marshal knelt beside him, pressing a heavy knee between Preston's shoulder blades, and loudly read him his federal rights. I stood on the front porch, watching the man who had tried to evict me yesterday morning, now laying face down in the dirt, completely ruined. My mother was kneeling on the grass, clutching her sobbing daughter, while my father stood entirely alone, utterly disgraced, and universally despised by the family he had tried to rule. The dominoes had not just fallen. They had completely shattered, leaving absolutely nothing behind but the undeniable truth. The federal marshals hauled Preston up from the frost-covered grass, his designer suit completely ruined by the dirt and his own pathetic tears. They marched him toward the back of the black heavy-duty SUV, his head pushed down as they shoved him into the back seat. The heavy door slammed shut with a sound of absolute finality. The three federal vehicles reversed out of my driveway, their sirens completely silent now, taking the fake tech investor away to face decades in a federal penitentiary. The two local county sheriffs who had arrived with the marshals remained on the property. The older officer, the same one who had arrested Preston the night before, walked over to my parents and my sister. Chantel was still sitting on the frozen lawn, completely catatonic, staring at the empty space where the federal SUVs had just been parked. The officer cleared his throat, his voice devoid of any sympathy. He informed my father that the federal raid did not invalidate the legal eviction notice I had verified the previous night. In fact, the officer stated that since they had just attempted to use a forged court document to illegally claim residence, they had forfeited any remaining grace period. He looked at his watch and told my father that they had exactly 30 minutes to gather their immediate personal belongings and vacate the premises, or they would all be arrested for criminal trespassing and obstruction. My father did not argue. The fight was completely drained from his body. He looked like a hollow, broken shell of the arrogant patriarch who had slammed his fist on my Thanksgiving table just 2 days ago. He slowly walked over to Chantel, grabbed her by the arm, and pulled her up from the grass. My mother followed them in absolute silence, her head bowed in deep, suffocating shame as they walked past me and re-entered the house. I followed the police officers inside and stood quietly in the foyer watching the final destruction of their fake empire. Because the marshals had secured Preston's personal vehicle as evidence of his wire fraud, and because my parents had arrived in a leased sedan that was far too small to hold their accumulated luxury items. The packing process was an absolute disaster. They did not have the time to carefully fold their clothes into the expensive leather luggage they had bought with my father's stolen retirement funds. The local sheriff deputy went into the garage and handed them a box of heavy-duty black contractor garbage bags. I stood by the staircase and watched my sister Chantel, the woman who had demanded imported Italian cribs and custom nursery renovations, frantically stuffing her designer silk blouses and expensive maternity dresses into thick black plastic trash bags. She was sobbing uncontrollably, her tears falling onto the hardwood floor as the police officer repeatedly tapped his watch, rushing her along. My mother was moving like a ghost, silently throwing her expensive cosmetics and shoes into her own garbage bags. She did not look at me once. She could not bear to make eye contact with the daughter she had tried to rob in the middle of the night. My father was in the guest bedroom, hastily pulling his tailored suits off their wooden hangers and shoving them into the black plastic. The man who cared more about his public image than his own children was now being forced to pack his entire life into literal garbage bags under the strict supervision of armed law enforcement. When the 30 minutes were up, the officer announced that time was over. He ordered them toward the front door. They dragged their heavy black bags down the hallway, the plastic scraping loudly against the expensive floors. They looked like refugees fleeing a disaster zone of their own making. They hauled the bags out onto the front porch and threw them unceremoniously into the trunk and the back seat of my parents' leased sedan. The sheriff deputies walked down the driveway, got into their cruisers, and waited at the curb to ensure the family actually drove away. I stood in the open doorway, the cold morning air rushing into the foyer. My mother and Chantel had already climbed into the back seat of the car, hiding their faces from the neighborhood. But my father stopped at the bottom of the porch stairs. He turned around and looked up at me. He was desperate. He had lost his money, his reputation, his son-in-law, and his power. He needed one last attempt to regain some semblance of control. He slowly walked up the steps, leaving his black garbage bag resting on the concrete. He looked at me with red, exhausted eyes and tried to play the ultimate trump card. He lowered his voice, attempting to sound like the wise, benevolent father he had never been. He said my name softly, his voice trembling. He told me that we were still blood. He said that despite everything that had happened, despite the anger and the mistakes, we were still a family. He begged me to look into my heart and remember the biblical commandments about forgiveness. He asked me for one more chance, just a few weeks, to figure things out, claiming that throwing my own father out into the cold was a sin that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I looked at the man who had secretly gambled away his home, allowed his son-in-law to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars, and actively conspired to throw me and my young son into a moldy apartment. I looked him dead in the eye. I did not raise my voice, and I did not show a single ounce of the pain he had caused me over the past 35 years. Family builds you up, I said, my words sharp and absolute. You just tried to bury me. Enjoy the apartment. I stepped back into the foyer and grabbed the heavy brass handle. I swung the thick mahogany door shut with a loud, resounding thud. I reached up and turned the heavy steel deadbolt, locking them out of my life permanently. The silence that instantly swallowed the house was profound. It was not the tense, suffocating silence of walking on eggshells around toxic people. It was a pure, unadulterated peace. I stood in the foyer for a long moment, listening to the muffled sound of my father's car engine starting outside, followed by the crunch of tires rolling down the driveway and fading away down the street. I let out a long, deep breath. The massive weight that had been sitting on my chest since I was a little girl finally evaporated. I walked straight into the kitchen, the room where the initial Thanksgiving ambush had taken place. I walked past the dining table, ignoring the spot where Preston had slid his fake eviction notice. I opened the wine fridge, pulled out a bottle of expensive red wine, and poured myself a generous glass. I took a slow sip, letting the rich flavor ground me in the present moment. I pulled out a chair and sat down at the table, completely alone in my massive, quiet estate. A few minutes later, I heard the soft padding of small feet on the staircase. I turned around and saw my son Trey standing in the archway of the kitchen. He was holding his favorite stuffed bear, his wide brown eyes looking around the empty main floor. He walked over to me, looking up with a hesitant, hopeful expression. He asked me if the loud people were gone forever. I set my wine glass down, reached out, and pulled my beautiful son into a tight, fierce hug. I buried my face in his shoulder, breathing in the scent of his hair. I told him yes. I assured him that the loud people were gone, that nobody was ever going to yell in our house again, and that we were completely safe. Trey smiled a genuine, relaxed smile and wrapped his small arms around my neck. Sitting there with my son, the reality of what I had just accomplished fully settled into my mind. As a Black woman, I had been conditioned my entire life to carry the absolute heaviest burdens without ever showing a single crack. Society and culture had constantly demanded that I be the strong one, the resilient one, the one who absorbs the trauma and keeps the family together at all costs. We are taught that loyalty to our bloodline is absolute, even when that bloodline is actively bleeding us dry. We are expected to protect toxic men, to excuse enabling mothers, and to suffer in complete silence so that the facade of the unbroken Black family remains intact for the church and the community. But true strength is not quietly enduring abuse. True strength is refusing to be a human shield for other people's destructive choices. I realized that my father's gambling, my mother's manipulation, and my sister's insufferable vanity were a generational curse that had been passed down through decades of unchecked dysfunction. If I had bowed my head at that Thanksgiving dinner, if I had packed my bags and moved into that moldy apartment to keep the peace, I would have simply handed that exact same curse down to my son. I would have taught Trey that our worth is conditional and that our boundaries do not matter. I refused to let that happen. I chose my peace over their pride. I chose my son's future over my parents' toxic legacy. Breaking a generational curse is incredibly violent. It looks exactly like federal marshals on your front lawn and your family packing their belongings into black garbage bags. It requires you to be the villain in their narrative so you can be the hero in your own. And sitting in my quiet, safe, completely secure home, I knew I would gladly play the villain 1,000 times over to protect the sanctuary I had built. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that shared DNA does not obligate you to endure endless abuse. For too long, I believed that being a strong Black woman meant silently carrying the weight of my family's toxic dysfunction just to keep the peace. But I finally realized that accepting their disrespect would only pass that terrible generational curse down to my own son. True strength is not suffering in silence. True strength is having the courage to protect your peace, even if it means becoming the villain in their false narrative. You have the absolute right to change the locks on anyone who threatens your sanctuary. If you have ever had to set hard boundaries to protect your peace from toxic family members, share your story in the comments below, and please hit the subscribe button for more empowering content.